Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Hockey 101. We've got not just the facts, not just the figures, but the analysis, where no one else wants to put their stamp on a take, on an opinion, when no one wants to venture a guess. We'll certainly go out there and venture not just near, but far and wide to find you the best takes anywhere on the internet. And a man who has ventured far and wide in his pursuit of calling hockey games across this great country and soon across the world? Question mark? Maybe. But there's one thing we know. He's in the Zoom room with us. It's Dan K. Dan, welcome to the show.
Lucas, you might be talking across the world, but today we talk about a word that sounds like we're traveling across the universe, and that is the portal, the transfer portal, that is. No, we're not talking about going to space and Elon Musk and shooting rockets in the air. We're talking about the NCAA's transfer portal, how players move near and far in a way that's different than a world that I played in just over a decade ago, where I spent time, I called it last show, transferring as if I was playing a game of 3D chess. You know, Dan K transferring from one level of the NCAA to junior college to another level of the NCAA just to keep playing throughout my 4-year career. In today's world, the transfer portal is open for business, for all athletes, for all players. What does this mean in terms of NIL money, in terms of endowments, in terms of roster creation, in terms of competition, in terms of the numbers? We will break them all down today, Lucas. And before we bring in the man with all the brains in his head that has those numbers and can break them down and make them make sense to you all at home, Lucas, talk to me, break down this topic, and introduce this man in.
Well, I think it's very interesting, right? When you look at the portal, when you look at the way that hockey has changed in just a few months, and you look at something like the portal that has existed for a while, but now is going to fundamentally change like the rest of the sport, I think it leaves things that are very open-ended. What exceptions will there be? Where's the money going to be involved? How much are our players going to be able to make their own choices? Will those choices be tampered with by others who are a little bit nefarious? There's only one way to know, Dan, and the only way to know is to bring in a man who sits just under us in the Zoom room box. Dan, you mentioned space, and you know what the brightest object in the universe used to be? It's the stars, but now it's this man's freshly shaven head. It's Bob Turo. Bob, welcome into the show.
I'm dizzy already from you guys. Let's get going.
I've had too much coffee. I'm ready to rock.
Let's go.
And Bob, you've got these numbers laid out right now. We've dug through with a guest that you'll see a little bit of today, Sydney Wolf, who has been diving deep into the numbers of the transfer portal here since this begun and since this got underway in this new age for NCAA hockey. And you've dove into the numbers here. We want to pop some stuff up on the screen. And Bob, I want you to kind of run us through what you've seen, what you've researched, what you've walked through, and where you think the transfer portal in the NCAA at the Division I ranks stands today as of last year's transfer portal movement.
So I'm going to use the portal and go back 25 years when I was working in the OHL. And when we were in the OHL, we were able to do something that they can still do today, which is trade hockey players, which of course you can't do in Division I hockey. And there were basically two types of trades that were made. Teams that were loading up to go for it all. We're coming up to the NHL trade deadline anyways, and you're going to see that happening at the National Hockey League level. Or there was a very wise scout that I used to work for when I first started out in the OHL, and he very crudely, permission to speak crudely, granted.
Oh, I mean, you can grant your own permission. We don't. Lucas,
This is
are we
your
charging
show.
this thing? I don't
It's not
think
my show. It's not my show.
You're the boss.
He said, I'm going to trade my shit for your shit. So let's tone it down a little bit. I'm going to trade my underachiever for your underachiever. Okay, we're dealing with educational institutions. Let's tone it down even a little bit more. Okay, like a kinder way of stating that we're going to take players that are looking for a better fit or coaches that maybe are looking to squeeze players out. It's kind of the portal is kind of the NCAA way of trading things, because in junior hockey, everybody's protected and you either have to be waived or you have to be traded to get to another team. Here, the players can trade themselves. So it's I need this is crazy.
Yeah.
Again, we come back to it's free agency and players can do what they want. And so with Sydney's numbers, that are 90% accurate, and they're 90% accurate because the NCAA doesn't allow the public, even though they talk about transparency. I'm not talking about the Division I coaches or teams, I'm talking about Indianapolis NCAA, the governing body. They don't let the public see this. So what has to happen, of course, is you get reporters like Sydney Wolf or some others that have to pick up news stories and start cutting and pasting and putting it together. So what we dove into when we took a look at the 300 plus players that were in the portal for last year coming into this year, what were the trends? That's really what we were looking at. And I would say the trends that I saw were the Blue Bloods. They don't lose many players. None of significance anyways. There was one exception. We'll cover it later. It's a Big Ten team, but they've made it up on the other end. Then there were some teams that didn't lose anybody at all in the portal. Cornell didn't. Ohio State didn't. And then there was a team that lost 21 players. And it was because they made a coaching change in the summer, which triggers a rule within the portal that if that change happens, players can then look to get to a new program. And maybe this is a good spot for you guys to give the audience some context about the portal, its origins, what was before the portal, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and for folks at home who might be newer to this NCAA realm, who might have a young athlete who's about to get in the NCAA hockey, and this is your first bout with the NCAA and how it all works, for years, for decades, the way that the NCAA has worked transferring has been that if you do so, you must sit out a year before you then partake at your new school that you transfer to. As time went on, there started to be some loopholes to that transfer process. If your school did not offer a grad student to play athletics, which some schools don't, many Ivy League schools do not, you were allowed to then transfer and play right away. If your school did not have a major that you intended to change to, and you were transferring to another school with a different major, there could be exceptions made in those occasions. These were still few and far between. In most cases, if you attempted to transfer, you would have to sit out a year before participating again. Legal actions from different places, from different parties, have kind of changed that realm. And the NCAA has had a history of when legality gets involved, they turn toe the exact opposite direction. Whether it's their work with EA Sports when Ed O'Bannon sued over his likeness being played as a UCLA former player in a video game and sued the NCAA for the use of his likeness, whether his name was there or not. And the NCAA scrapped EA Sports college video games for the next decade until NIL became available this year. All the way to these transfer portal situations where lawsuits have put them into a place where they said, you know what? It is easier, rather than having exceptions or having a governing body overseeing transfers, it's easier to just open up the floodgates and allow these players to move at will at the end of each season and just provide a window for them to do so. And that is where we now sit today, Bob, with these numbers that you're seeing. And I think now it's time to dig into, I mean, what does it all mean? Is there player poaching? Is this the Wild West? Is it a pretty tame world we live in today with hockey transfer portal work? It's you look at the football world and you hear nothing but horror stories, or nothing but scary stories, or nothing but stories of millions and tens of millions of dollars being thrown around by rich benefactors of schools. Where do we stand right now in NCAA ice hockey?
Yeah, so there's always a group of guys every year that their names will show up in the portal, but then, around winter of the next season, their names aren't showing up on any rosters. I can't find any information on them on social media. Just they hung up the skates essentially. They're not playing anywhere, at least, for a university or a team that would be like on elite prospects type thing. They might still be playing, but not at a school or professionally. So there's always a group of those guys, but a large chunk of the players that don't end up anywhere, a lot of times I think they're guys that, they probably only would have transferred somewhere if it was a very specific situation that they wanted. Like, let's say maybe they only entered their name because they would only be open to maybe one or two programs if they were contacted by them. Or it might just be guys that, they finished up their senior year because for those who don't know, a lot of the Ivy League schools and some other schools as well, if they don't have graduate programs, once you're a senior, you can't use your fifth year of eligibility at some places, or if they don't have graduate programs sometimes. So some of those guys, if they're seniors, they might just be saying, I might want to try my luck, see who contacts me. Maybe I could play a fifth year somewhere, but maybe, they didn't find anywhere, or they had a couple maybe schools contact them and they just said, you know what, I'd rather just do something else with my life. So there's always a group of guys that, are moving on for one reason or another, but a lot of them tend to be guys that probably couldn't use that fifth year, that COVID year at the school they're at. So they were probably just kind of testing the waters and seeing what would happen if they put their name in the portal. That's usually a big chunk of those guys. A lot of guys go to Division III. There's a large chunk too that go to U Sports, like you said. There's a couple that'll end up playing club hockey too, or ACHA, that type of thing. And a very few, a handful will go back to juniors. But usually they would only go back to juniors if, their age would permit that. A lot of guys probably age-wise wouldn't be able to go back to juniors. But if they're a guy that went to college at 18 or 19, didn't do so great that first year, might want to go back to juniors and see what their options are after that. A handful of guys will do that every year, usually in the USHL, a couple in the BC. But that's pretty rare. But D3 is definitely a big popular destination for a lot of guys, just because some guys might end up going to Division I programs. They might not get a lot of playing time and they might just go, this isn't the best fit for me. Or they might just want to go to D3 and, get a lot of playing time at a different program. So that's absolutely a option that a lot of guys take advantage of, whether that's D3 or U Sports or club hockey. So you'll see a lot of guys end up doing that. So a large portion of guys will find a new home at a different D1 program, but there's a lot of other places you can end up if you enter the portal.
Are you seeing specifically any of the big time schools? On this show, we call them the Blue Bloods.
Sure.
Are they poaching players who have overachieved at non-Blue Bloods? Have you dug in that hard to see if Michigan, BU, Denver, that they're poaching other schools?
Yeah, I feel like I get that question a lot, just because there are definitely a lot of people that don't like the transfer portal, and that's their main concern is, are the big programs, going to scoop up all these good players from other programs? And I'd say, a little bit yes, and also a little bit no at the same time. It's kind of just a mix of things. There are definitely some of those big time schools that have scooped up good players, that's for sure. But at the same time, too, I think sometimes when you're a good player at one of those smaller schools, maybe, or the less, traditional powers, if you're the best player on that team and you transfer to one of the Blue Bloods, you might be one of 5 or 6 really good players. So then you might not be in the same situation you were at other schools. So I don't see it being a huge problem quite yet. Just because, if you're the best player on a team from, I'm sorry, Atlantic Hockey, but if you're the best player on one of the Atlantic Hockey teams and you transfer to, let's say, an NCHC school or maybe a Big Ten school, you might be the best player on that one team, but if you transfer to another team that has a lot of good players, you're in a completely different situation. So sometimes for those guys, I feel like there might be a couple situations where that does happen every year, but there's it's like a case by case thing. So I haven't seen it being an overwhelming thing yet of, oh, this player's really good at this school, he's gonna leave no matter what. It's kind of just a different story for everybody, but I haven't seen it be an overwhelming trend quite yet. But it could obviously change in the future. I have no idea.
What I decided to do was take a look at the current rankings by the NCAA and take a look at the top 5 teams. And those top 5 teams were Boston College, Minnesota State, Minnesota, Western Michigan, and Maine. Can we really get granular right now, guys? Because here we go.
People love when you do.
Here we go. Boston College. They ended up losing 3 players in the portal. 2 of them were NHL draft picks. One was Simas Paul, he's a grad student, 4th round pick into the National Hockey League, played with the development program. BC really didn't have a lot of playing time and ended up at Merrimack, and he's having a decent year there. He's got 17 points in 27 games. Charlie Letty, he's a sophomore, 4th round pick in the NHL, 2 seasons at BU, not many points. Over to Quinnipiac, not many points. You're going to see that theme a lot. Guys really not working out where they started out their Division I career, and it's not working out where they went. Remember the old shit for shit? It's just underachiever for underachiever. Now, there's some exceptions to this, and we're going to get into that. Matthew Argentina, player, played at BC for 2 years, had 5 points. He's at Northern Michigan in 12 games, so he's not even playing all the games. He's got 2 points. I'm getting to those players that are exceptions in a second. They only picked up one person in the portal. Brady Berard, another national team player, 2 years at Providence with 11 points total. At BC, he's got 5 points in 26 games played. The conclusion I come to with Boston College is every year, they're not using the portal. Every year, it's a total reload with young studs, plain and simple. And if you take a look at the national development team, it's one of the main landing spots where their players end up going. Minnesota State. They lost 3 players in the portal of no significance whatsoever, so we're not even going to mention their names. Here's who they gained. Luigi Benacasa, a sophomore, played in the AJ, where he had lots of points, had a good year at Ferris State. Average year at Minnesota State, 13 points in 30 games. He's a sophomore at 22 years of age. You're going to see that as a theme as well. Sophomores who are 21, 22. I mean, we're going to be talking about 24 and 25-year-olds. At some point in time when I was looking at this, I thought I was looking at East Coast Hockey League rosters. I mean, come on. Matthew Syverson, goaltender, they picked up Minnesota State. From he had an .853 save percentage at Lindenwood, hasn't played at Minnesota State. Finley Williams, sophomore from the BCHL, went to Notre Dame, had 2 points in 22 games over at Minnesota State. They're the number 2 ranked team in the country. He's got 2 points in 13 games. And Ralph Bergmanis, he's a junior. He's a defenseman, so it's hard to talk about production. He's got 8 points in 27 games. My conclusion with Minnesota State is they do their building through recruiting.
Yep.
Not to mean that they won't pick somebody up in the portal that maybe they recruited before, but they lost out in the recruiting battle. But right now, the number 1 and 2 teams are built straight through recruiting. Then you go to Minnesota. They lost 4 players. Carl Fish, a grad student, He ended up moving. He had 13 points in 4 years at Minnesota. As a grad student at Providence, he's only played in 9 games. He's got no points. Owen, boy, this is going to be tough for me. Bardo Skivich. I can't even say it, guys. I apologize to Owen. He was a sophomore goalie in 22-23, played 6 games at Minnesota with an 883 save percentage. He went back to the USHL and the NHL. Now he's at Lindenwood and having a solid season. Obviously, it is a step down from the Big Ten, but he's got a 9.81% save percentage in 25 games. And in fairness to him, goalies take a little bit longer to develop. Garrett Pino Niemi. He's a junior. 6 points in 64 games at Minnesota. He went to Nebraska Omaha. In 21 games, he's got 3 points. And Charlie Strobel, he's a junior. 2 years at Minnesota. He had 6 points in 50 games. He went to Colorado College. He's played only in 6 games, and he's got 1 point. So remember what I said before about squeezing players out? Sometimes players don't even need to be told by the coach. They just know there's not going to be a spot there for them. Here's the gains, and they had 2 of them. Liam Sulari. He's a grad student, 4 years at Penn State. The last 2 years as a starter at Minnesota, he's got a 927 save percentage in 17 games. A significant pickup for Minnesota. Matt Wood, first-round draft choice to the Nashville Predators. 2 very good years at UConn. First year at Minnesota, 29 points in 29 games. So what Minnesota has done, and this is just a snapshot of 1 year, is they again are a place where the best players on the continent are going to end up, and they heavy load on Minnesota kids, of course. But the conclusion is they're reloading with young kids, and here this year they're getting 2 players who are portal players that are making a significant impact. And let's specifically look at Matt Wood. Nil. Wouldn't it be nice to know if this kid's getting any nil money?
Be nice to know who's getting nil money throughout all of hockey, right? You don't get the same reporting that you get when ESPN or any news outlet, FS1, all these different spots, have 20 people who are overseeing what Alabama's paying for each player, what Michigan's paying for each player. The same coverage isn't coming for hockey right now.
I wonder, guys, how much money is there in nil money is there in college hockey? Remember, if we go back to like episode 3 and 4 that we did, I told you that people said that there was money out there, not just with the Blue Bloods, but with some of the programs underneath. But everybody was really tight-lipped. I wonder if that nil money is going to be more prevalent with the rule change with the CHL. We're going to find out on March 23rd.
Well, I think it's interesting too when you look at the total number, right? It's like, yes, where's the money going? Where's the money coming from? And then the real question, like you're, I think, getting at is, what's the total pot look like, right? It's really easy to look around, and especially with football, right, and look around and have some fun adding numbers together. But when you add the numbers across, you call it the entirety of D1 football, right? Even if you take the top 25 teams, that's a huge total. And I think, unfortunately for hockey, you see it at the NHL level, right, where sometimes there is not really the appearance of major financial investment, right? You, even if they are, I'm not saying whether they are or they aren't, the appearance is that they're trying to keep it on the back end. They're trying to not do that as much, even though there's rumors of the salary cap increasing over the next few years. I think that attitude's pervasive in hockey, but I also think that the people who put money into the sports in general are still a little unsure about how hockey gets monetized. We're seeing it in juniors too, right? Where it's hard for teams to get sponsorships outside of, fans buying tickets for $5-10 a pop because people are just not quite sure how popular is hockey really.
Yeah, and the question is this: who's the Johnny Manziel of college hockey in the last decade? That pause from both of you, both guys who watch a good amount of hockey, who know a good amount about hockey, right? The money in college football, if I ask you the Johnny Manziel of college football, you say Johnny Manziel. You might say Jimmer Fredette in basketball. You might say Zion Williamson in basketball. You might say, going back 15, 20 years, to the Kevin Durant's of the world and the Blake Griffins who are playing against each other at Texas and Oklahoma. There have always been names, marketable names, in basketball and football, where the NIL money pays you back is in those likenesses, right? You're paying for those likenesses because those are signed autographs, those are signed footballs, those are signed posters, those are signed T-shirts with the Kentucky logo on it. Those are Christian Laettner autographs on Duke basketballs. Like, you make money, there is a clear path line to making your money back. Rich, successful people are not much for giving away money without money coming back in return or some value coming back in return. That's going to be the big question with hockey. How does hockey begin to turn itself into the same sort of money-making structure that has been created in basketball and football that other NCAA sports just don't have right now?
Let's look at 4 and 5 because they're built totally different than 1, 2, and 3.
Yep.
Western Michigan lost 3 players in the portal. 2 of them no significance. One, Cole Birch, who's a 24-year-old sophomore. Let that sink in for a second. Okay? He only played 3 games at Western Michigan, but he went to Ferris State. And at Ferris State, he's having a decent year. He should have as a 24-year-old. He has 19 points in 28 games. However, they added 6 players. Brian Kramer, a 24-year-old from Robert Morris, so a poach. He had 12 points. He transferred to AIC for 3 years after Robert Morris, and now he's at Western Michigan. And at Western Michigan, he's got, in 26 games played, he has 10 points. But he's a man. Tristan Lemray, a grad student, 24 years old, 2 years at Denver. If he was at Denver, you would think that he, at some point in time, he had a ton of potential. At Western Michigan this year as a grad student, 26 games played, 11 points. Jack Messick, 22-year-old defenseman. He was a freshman at Ferris with 10 points. He's only played 5 games this year at Western Michigan. Robbie Drasner, 24 years old. Getting a theme here, guys?
Yep.
Defenseman from Miami at 4 years. At Western Michigan, he's played in all 26 games. Grant Slukniewski. Boy, I've got to work on my pronunciations here. 22 years old. He was a freshman at Northern Michigan. He had 9 points. Okay. In 34 games at Western Michigan, he has 21 points in 26 games. And then Liam Valentine, 21-year-old. He's a junior this year. 2 average years production-wise at Providence. Solid first year at Western Michigan with 21 points in 26 games. What I see here is older, and what I see here is some production.
Yeah.
And that's how they're building their team there. You would think in the state of Michigan, when it comes to the very best players, that State and Michigan are going to get the cream of the crop, and not too far down the road in Columbus is Ohio State, and not too far to the west is Notre Dame. So, I mean, they're looking to build their team a different way. Maine is 5. They lost 4 players. Lower level production players. Okay. But they gained. And again, they brought in Charlie Russell, a sophomore, 21. He had 7 games at Clarkson. and 37 games in the USHL. At Maine this year, he's an older player as a sophomore, 10 points in 24 games. Ross Mitten, a graduated from Colgate. He was their leading scorer. He's got 10 points in 26 games at Maine. Taylor McCarr, senior, they're bringing in. He had 3 average seasons at UMass. He has 23 points in 27 games. And they brought in another player, Frank Jurasovic. And in 22 games, he has 19 points. He was a freshman at Merrimack. My conclusion here is they're not quite as old as Western Michigan, but they're older. And you're getting a sense with these top 5 how different teams are built. If we slid down a little bit and looked at Michigan and looked at BU and looked at Dakota, you'd see more of the Minnesota way of building a team. If you went to Ohio State, for example, you'd find surprisingly an older team. So you're getting a picture of how these teams are built within the rules of the game right now. But the common theme throughout has been if somebody struggled in one place, they continue to struggle. 80% of them continue to struggle where they were going. So when the players enter the portal, there's no guarantee that they're going to end up with a new situation that is a bed of roses.
And I think that's the biggest story for every athlete in every sport right now in NCAA. I think there is this belief that, things aren't going right. Let's just move, right? And I think that's the reason why in past episodes we've talked about the Nick Sabans of the world who have left the sport world because of this NCAA transfer portal. In the college game, you've seen coaches from the University of Miami, University of Virginia, these big names starting to say, hey, I can't handle this new age of things go wrong, I transfer, and there's always greener pastures. Sometimes there are no pastures left. And I think that turns, Bob, to how we kind of get towards the back end of this conversation, which is the same way I beat Lucas at chess, right? Lucas is better than me at chess. He's a professional chess player. At that level, when he's about to beat me, I just flip the table over. Here, let's flip the argument over. We're looking at numbers from a year without the CHL. We're looking at numbers from a year that was normalcy, as we can call it, as close to normalcy as we call it in NCAA recruiting. The CHL now opens up a better level of athlete, many would say, right? A better level of hockey player that you never had access to before, many would say. How does this affect the transfer portal this upcoming year? How does this affect what types of players are now going into the transfer portal or who may be going into the transfer portal? And how many more players do we see enter that portal and maybe end up in Division III or end up at that low-level European professional hockey? I got to imagine things look much different heading into next year.
Don't you think, guys, that teams have to over-recruit because they don't know who's going to leave their program next year? And you ask about the CHL. Well, I'm told by agents and I'm told by Division I coaches that there's some action with what we've said all along is what it comes down to with the CHL NCAA fight for the best players. It's about the 17 and 18-year-olds who are going to have been or going to be NHL draft picks. And nobody knows how many of those kids are going to skip from the CHL and leave their junior eligibility behind and come to play Division I. We won't know that until the clock really strikes 12 on March 23rd, I think it is, when the CHL season ends and teams start getting eliminated. So, I mean, it's, again, a situation where we just don't know.
Yeah.
But I would guess that if there is a bunch of kids who are younger kids coming from the CHL, it would mean, because kids are smart, they're in university, right, guys?
Yep.
That they can see the writing on the wall, and they may have been bumped down from the fifth defenseman to the sixth or the seventh or the eighth defenseman and may look for greener pastures. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah, percent.
Yeah, I think
I
so. And
mean,
I think the biggest thing is that we talked about it in the intro, right? That there's a lot of people out there who are throwing out facts and figures, but they're not guessing. They're afraid to kind of take a stab at what they might see. And I think part of that is because is we really don't know what might happen. Before we started recording, right, I kind of gave a hypothetical about guys who were on the bottom end of they were the fifth or sixth forward, like you said, or fifth or sixth defenseman out of the seventh or eighth. Do they go from a more prestigious school to a less prestigious school to secure playing time because they don't know, because of that uneasiness, because of that unsureness? Bob, you responded with, well, we've seen how this has worked up to this point. Players will stay with the more prestigious institution for the practice, for the chance, for the opportunity. But even that might get turned on its head here. Uneasiness and not knowing has a way of really infecting the minds of, especially of players who for their whole life have had to stay on that cutting edge, right? We know how stressful hockey is. We are seeing the ultra competitive 6U quad A teams popping up now. So it's only getting worse. And I think when you finally reach that college level and all of a sudden you see there might be 5 guys coming down the pipeline ready to take your job and sit you up in the bleachers counting shots on goal, that might change some things.
Well, the big thing is this. To put it into perspective for those of us, we have a lot of people who watch this who are trying to learn all of the hockey landscape, right? Who may not even be as big in depth in the hockey world as we may think a lot of our listeners are. To put it into perspective, Florida, Texas, and California are the 3 states that create the most Division I NCAA football players, right? Those are the 3 hotbeds for football recruiting. This is the equivalent of Florida, Texas, and California had not made up the player base in NCAA Division I football. And all of a sudden this year, they go, yep, now those 3 states can send kids to school. The transfer portal might look a lot different in college football. If you're sitting in a pretty good spot right now as the starting quarterback at Toledo, you may stay put. I don't know what the future is going to look like if I transfer to an Alabama. I don't know what the future is going to look like if I transfer to a University of Texas or a University of Auburn. I don't know what's coming down the pipeline because we've never seen this before. It's unprecedented. There is a level of athlete that is now available to schools that I am competing against, not just in the fellow NCAA player base that's moving into that portal, but from the CHL. It is going to be interesting to see the repercussions that it may have on. There may be less transferring than ever. There may be more than ever. I'm excited to see what happens. I'm interested at the very least to see what happens. Bob, any kind of closing thoughts as we get towards the end of this?
March 23rd, guys. That's when the game starts. CHL season ends, and we're going to find out if they're going to get these 17 and 18-year-olds. It's not that far away. We're talking, less than a month and 10 days sort of thing. And that's it. I mean, we're going to find out if there's a big impact. But as far as the portal goes here, yeah, there's been some poaching. I feel for schools like RIT who lost their top 2 scorers last year to Ohio State and Wisconsin. I expected to see way more of that. There was only a handful of those situations. But we're going to see the final ramifications starting March 23rd.
It'll be very interesting. And the best place to continue to educate yourselves as we educate ourselves along with you up until March 23rd and even after the fallout starts to happen. Best place is right here at Hockey 101. We've got the analysis. We've got the facts. We've got the guests. And you know what? We've got the predictions. We're willing to put our reputations on the line because you know what? Most of the time we think we've pretty much got our handle on the situation. I want to thank both of these gentlemen. Also want to thank Sydney, who you've seen interspersed in this episode. We recorded a long conversation with Sydney about her work, about some of her conclusions that informed what you saw in this episode. So we want to thank her for participating in this, for kind of jumping back and forth here with this conversation. And as always, you can reach out to us if you want to get on the mailing list. If you want to get your comments on the show, you can look down below. That's exactly who to email, where to send those comments. You'll be a part of Hockey 101.